They miserably ravaged and pillaged everything. They trod the holy things under their polluted feet. They dug down the altars and plundered all the treasures of the church. Some of the brethren they slew, some they carried off with them in chains, the greater number they stripped naked, insulted, and cast out of doors, and some they drowned in the sea.
These were the words of the chronicler Simeon of Durham about the Viking attack on Lindisfarne in 793. But what happened, where and when, and how did this impact history? This is the timeline of Viking history, Part 1. The Vikings originated from what is now Scandinavia, encompassing Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The first author who wrote about the Scandinavians was the Roman writer Tacitus, who in his Germania from 98 AD mentions the Suenes, or Swedes. The earliest clear reference to the Norse gods is found on a golden bracteater discovered in Denmark in 2020. The research team from the National Museum in Copenhagen announced that this is evidence that shows Odin, the supreme gods of the Nordic pagan religions, was worshipped as early as 401, and it features a Proto-Norse elder Futhark inscription reading he is Odin's man. During the 7th and 8th centuries, Europe was growing wealthier and Scandinavian furs were highly prized items. It is believed that this early trade taught the pre-Viking people about sailing technology, the politics of Europe, and its weak points. As Scandinavians went out to Europe to trade, they obtained good prices for their items, while also buying goods that did not exist or were hard to come by in Scandinavia. However, their reach was limited due to underdeveloped ship technology, which improved over time. The most famous early raid occurred in 793 at Lindisfarne, located in northeast England. However, Lindisfarne was not the first Viking raid recorded. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe an attack in 787. Although the location is unclear, it's believed that these people were Vikings on their first raid. Another attack occurred in 791 in southern England, stating that,
"This year came the first 3 ships of the Northmen from the land of robbers. They ravaged and pillaged. These were the first ships of the Danish men that sought the land of ours."
Inspired by their early success, Viking raids became more numerous. In 792, they targeted undefended island monasteries in the Hebrides and Northern Ireland. 4 years later, continental Europe was struck, with the island monastery of St. Philibert's on Normier near the Loire River was targeted in 799. The Oseberg ship, buried in Norway in 830, is arguably the finest artifact to have survived the Viking Age. The discovery of the skeletons of 2 women alongside the ship burial came as a surprise to archaeologists, as the richness of the burial indicated that the women were of noble status, or even possibly a jarl buried alongside a slave or servant girl. This finding sheds light on the position of Viking women in society. Although they did not have the same rights as men, Viking women still held more power and autonomy than women in other societies at the time. They were able to divorce their husbands, own land, and control the family fortune chest, making them the de facto leaders of their households. In 839 or 840, Viking settlers founded the city of Dublin in Ireland when the Viking longboats sailed into the River Liffey. They built a long fort or ship harbor on the south bank of the river, which was used as a winter camp. When the Vikings began to settle in the area, their settlement became known as Deaflin or Dyflin, modern-day Dublin. The strategic position of Deaflin was perfect, located downriver, further inland, but also easily accessible from the sea. The Vikings used their settlement as a base for performing more inland raids on places such as Luxor and Meath. This was only the start of a long Viking presence in Ireland. In the founding population of Iceland, which had about 20,000 people, it has been proven that 60% of women and 20% of males had Gaelic origin. Check out my video Viking women for more on that, meaning that they were most likely taken in raids and enslaved before being brought to the cold island in the north. I pity the Irish at this time. In 844, a Viking raid on Seville was repulsed, marking the end of Viking attacks in the area. The quick military response by Emir Abd Rahman II of Cordoba and the subsequent defensive improvements discouraged further Viking attacks in the region. However, this did not prevent the Vikings from continuing their raids in other areas. In 845, the Viking siege of Paris marked the beginning of a series of 13 attacks on the city. The Viking forces, led by a chieftain named Ragnar, sailed up the River Seine with a fleet of 120 ships, carrying thousands of men. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, assembled his army on both sides of the Seine, but the Vikings quickly steered their ships towards the side with the smallest force and defeated them. When the forces on the other side saw this, they fled in fear. The Vikings then plundered and occupied Paris and withdrew only when they received a ransom of 7,000 French libras, or 2.5 tons of silver and gold. Between 859 and 865, Bjorn Ironside and Halfdan led an estimated 60 ships in raids up the rivers in France, attacking almost defenseless cities and towns. The Vikings then turned their attention to the Mediterranean, wreaking havoc throughout Italy and beyond. In 860, Rus Vikings attacked Constantinople, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, catching the city unprepared as the empire was preoccupied by ongoing Arab-Byzantine wars. After pillaging the suburbs of the Byzantine capital, the Rus retreated for the day and continued their siege at night, causing disorganization among the Byzantine troops, but the attack ultimately failed. This event gave rise to a later Orthodox Christian tradition that attributed the deliverance of Constantinople to miraculous intervention by the Theotokos. In 862, Rurik, a Rus Viking chieftain thought to be from Sweden, founded the city of Novgorod, which later became the seat of the Rurik dynasty, a dynasty that would last for hundreds of years, reflecting the long-lasting impact of Viking expansion and settlement. The Viking invasions of Britain during the 9th century were a defining moment in European history. The legendary figure of Ragnar Lothbrok invaded Northumbria, but was captured and killed by King Ella. In 865, the Great Heathen Army, believed to be the largest Viking army ever, invaded Britain. Led by figures such as Ivar the Boneless Bjorn Ironside and other supposed sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the Vikings targeted key Anglo-Saxon cities such as York, which they conquered in 866. The city was renamed Jorvik and became a prosperous Viking kingdom in England. However, the Viking reign in Jorvik was not uncontested. Anglo-Saxons and Vikings fought for control of the city many times, and in 954, the last Viking king Eric Bloodaxe was expelled, and the kingdom of Jorvik was reabsorbed into Northumbria. The Viking attacks on England were so numerous that only one kingdom, Wessex, was able to record an important win. King Alfred the Great of Wessex recorded a decisive victory against a Danish Viking army in 871. This led the Danes to settle in an area north of Wessex called Danelaw. Meanwhile, in 872, Harald Fairhair became the first king of Norway, consolidating his rule over the country by defeating an allied army of Norwegian petty kings at the Battle of Hafrsfjord. According to the sagas, it was in response to Harald Fairhair's tyranny that many Vikings left Norway for Iceland, and in 874, the Viking settlement of Iceland began. Although Gardar Svavarson and his men had arrived there by mistake in 820, it was not until 874 that the first intentional Viking settlers arrived. Engulfur Arnarson claimed the land that became the city of Reykjavik, and many more followed after him. The Viking invasions continued in England, with the Great Heathen Army driving the Mercian king into exile and finally conquering Mercia after a decisive battle in 874. 4 years later, in 878, the Vikings invaded Wessex. The Viking king Guthrum broke a treaty with Alfred and surprise attacked the Anglo-Saxons during Christmas. Wessex seemed all but conquered, but a trapped Anglo-Saxon army rallied back and defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. Alfred later obtained a treaty with Guthrum, which this time actually lasted. The Vikings retained control over the Danelaw, located east of Wadling Street, while King Alfred retained Wessex and what was left of Mercia. The Rus Vikings, in 879, extended their control to Kiev, which soon became the center of their domains in modern-day Ukraine. It is believed that this was a capitulation by the Rus, who made the Vikings their rulers instead of fighting them. The Vikings assimilated and quickly adopted the Kievan culture, building one of the most successful Viking settlements in history, even giving their name to a modern-day country, Russia. The term Rus may have originated from an area northeast of modern-day Stockholm called Roslagen. In 885 to 886, the Vikings, led by Rollo, or Rolf the Walker and Siegfried, besieged Paris for the second time. The Parisians held out under their leader Count Odo, and Emperor Charles the Fat eventually came to relieve them. However, upon seeing the fury of the Vikings, he paid them to go fight someone else instead of calling for battle against him. The Vikings took the gold offered and devastated other parts of France instead. This act was perceived as cowardice by the Parisians, and was one of the final nails in the coffin for the Carolingians in France, and Count Odo replaced Charles as ruler in 888. The Viking rulers in England followed different laws compared to the rest of the country. Strangely, in many ways, Viking rules were less harsh than the British, and there were fewer slaves in the Danello areas of the country than in Wessex. Because the Vikings, unlike the British, had a trial with judges, and they also had a jury, with 12, 24, or 36 jurors, depending on the importance of the case. A few years later, Swedish Olaf the Wise led a force to Constantinople and was paid a massive ransom to turn around and leave. In 907, the Byzantine Empire made a trade agreement with Prince Oleg of the Rus Vikings to curb their activity in the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, one of the most powerful empires in Europe, had been forced to its knees by the Rus, making the empire employ Vikings as the personal bodyguards of the emperor, called the Varangian Guard. One of the most famous Varangian guards were the later king of Norway, Harald Hardrade, who died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. In 912, an even more favorable agreement was obtained for the Vikings. These agreements marked the beginning of the Byzantine Empire's relationship with the Rus Vikings and had long-lasting implications for trade and diplomacy between the two regions. The Battle of Titan Hall, which took place in 910, saw forces from Mercia and Wessex combined to defeat the Northumbrian Vikings. This battle marked the defeat of the last great Danish Viking army to ravage England. The battle had significant implications for the political and military landscape of England, leading to the establishment of a unified English state. In Part 2, we will continue with the establishment of Normandy when the king in West Francia gave in to the Viking raids. So remember to subscribe and put on all notifications so you don't miss that. And I hope to see you in the next one.
Skål.